All right, next I want to talk about California's modern advanced economies. In the past, we've talked about primary industries such as agriculture, which is an important one in California. And now we want to talk about higher levels of industry. So just as a reminder, just to review, we're talking about the economic geography of California. And this is the way that the labor and economic activity is geographically distributed in a place. And one frame that we use to talk about that is economic sectors. That we talked about primary, secondary, and tertiary economic sectors, and we focused in the previous chapter on primary, and now we're going to look at some higher level economic sectors. So just a reminder, this is sort of an illustration of kind of a theoretical illustration where at the bottom of the pyramid you have the primary sector, like agricultural production. This essentially is harvesting or using commodities from nature. And above that, you have the secondary sector, which is more like the manufacturing sector. That can include construction, canning of agricultural goods, food processing, that sort of thing. And then above that, we have the tertiary or the service sector. And then we could even kind of divide that up into higher levels. So let's take a closer look at these higher level sectors. So we've discussed primary in the past. Secondary industries are a step above that. So primary industries, if you recall, were mining, fishing, and the big one is agriculture. And the idea of the secondary industries is that you're increasing the value of a commodity by changing its form. Often these are what we might call blue-collar jobs. So for example, food processing, manufacturing, etc. So some examples: manufacturing, food processing, refineries. So while mining for oil is primary, the refining of the oil is secondary. Construction is included in primary. That's an important part of California's economy. Shipbuilding, and you could make a case that agribusiness can kind of slip into both categories because of how technically sophisticated it is. This is a figure showing manufacturing areas around California, big ones in Southern California, but really distributed through Central California and the Bay Area as well. All right, now beyond the secondary, we have the tertiary and what we typically call the service sector of the economy. That the idea is that rather than producing a physical good, you're providing some sort of a service. So cashiers, hotel workers, office workers fall within that tertiary part of the economy. So some examples include government, hospitality, education. What I'm doing right now, that's part of the service sector. Healthcare, tourism, sales, and so on. And the service sector can also, as some would argue, you could divide that up into higher levels as well. So quaternary, which would be sort of the fourth level, would be like white collar jobs, high-end service workers, researchers, etc. And then even a fifth level are quinary economic activities, and these we might sometimes refer to gold collar jobs. So for example, high-end or CEOs or high-level management of some sort. And very few people work in this sector, and these would be the highest paying jobs in the economy. So just to review, we have the primary sector, directly collecting things from nature. Secondary sector, like manufacturing, we often call these blue-collar jobs. Tertiary, quaternary, and quinary. Now let's talk about how the changes over time that industrialized country, this is from a physical cultural geography textbook, where it shows the change, and this is called MDC. These are more industrialized countries like the United States. LDCs would be less developed countries like in, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and other places that weren't part of the initial industrial revolution. And If we look at how things have changed over time, at one time in the sort of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, that everybody, most jobs in all places were primary economic activities. So most people were farmers. Most people grew food, and that was their job. And a few people worked, very few people worked in secondary or tertiary service or manufacturing. So with the Industrial Revolution, what you find is that these industrialized countries in red, you have a drop in primary activity and a rise in tertiary, secondary and tertiary activity. And then somewhere around the 1970s, you really start to have a drop off in manufacturing in industrialized countries, but a rise in tertiary economic activity. And where you see that dip there, what's happening is the less industrialized countries are taking up that slack, that a lot of manufacturing is essentially moving overseas in the 1970s. And so now the main part of our economy is the service sector. So this figure is a bit old, but it still holds up. If you look at where the jobs are, the growth in jobs over time, the primary sector is here. It's a tiny part of the number of people who work. Tiny part of the number of jobs in the primary sector. And with agriculture, one thing we discuss is that because it's so automated with equipment and economies of scale, that you don't need very many people to actually do the agricultural work. Manufacturing and construction is a bigger part of the economy, but it's relatively flat. And then you have the tertiary sector, which is a huge part of the economy. And most of the people, when I have a physical classroom, what I often do is ask people who works in primary, secondary, tertiary sector. Almost universally, most students work in the tertiary sector, and that's true of the economy overall. That is the biggest part of the workforce, is in that service sector of the economy. So this is a chart showing the relative numbers in each one. And this big green part is people who work in the service economy, the tertiary sector. Very small number in the primary, and kind of in the middle is the secondary.